and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. We resume our discussion of Colossians with chapter 1, verses 28 to 29. Now, before we get to the verses themselves, I want to make a note about how I'm breaking up this section. Verses 28 to 29 are still continuing the themes that we talked about last week. I stopped the last episode at the end of verse 27 because it was a good stopping point, and these two verses get into another point, but there is no natural break in the text at the end of verse 27. Really, there's not much of a break at all from verse 24 all the way until chapter 2, verse 5. There's a bit of a pause with 2:1, but for the most part, this whole section belongs together. Anyway, let's get to the verses, which say, "Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy that he powerfully works within me." Here we find the stated purpose of Paul's ministry, to present everyone mature in Christ. Mature, however, really isn't a strong enough word for what we see here. Another place this same Greek word is used is when Christ was on the cross and said, "It is finished." The word here means perfect or complete. It means that everything has been put as it should be and nothing has been left out. There are no imperfections. Just as all of Christ's work was complete, that is what is meant here. Only it means that there are no imperfections left in people. They are complete. Paul's goal is for Christians to be complete, lacking nothing. This gets at the same thing as holy, blameless, and above reproach that we talked about back in verse 22. If you want to know how this is possible, go back to the hymn and take a look at who Christ is and what he has done. In short, the way it has become possible to be renewed and walk with God is because the creator and renewer of humanity has made it possible. In verse 29, Paul makes another reference to the fact that he is struggling and toiling on behalf of the Colossians. He did this in verse 24 when he spoke of his sufferings, and he will do it again at the beginning of chapter 2. This does at least three things. 1, it lets the Colossians know how much he cares for them and that he has their best interest at heart. 2, it shows how important the message is, because if the message were unimportant, there'd be no reason to toil or suffer to deliver it. 3, it reminds them that it is the message about Christ that they need to listen to, rather than the alternative one that he will address and critique for most of chapter 2. Paul continues his train of thought with the first 5 verses of chapter 2. So let's take a look at those. Paul says, "For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all those who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance and understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments, for though I am absent in body, yet I am present with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and for the firmness of your faith in Christ." Paul says that he is struggling for the people at Colossae. Okay, why? Obviously there's a problem, otherwise he would not be worried about them. What we are going to find in the next section of the letter is that there is another worldview present at Colossae. Certain people are promoting this as a better option than Christianity. Now, the Colossians have not hopped on board with this, so Paul isn't angry with them. He is, however, worried that they might. So what he's doing in this section is making a transition from everything we've seen in chapter 1 about why a person should follow Christ to what we will see in chapter 2 about why a person should not follow the other worldview. Since Christianity is actually true and it is the only path to renewal, Paul is worried that the Colossians might be tempted to leave it for something that is not true and will not lead one to renewal. There are 3 parts to the hope that Paul has for the Colossians that he lists in verses 2 to 3. They are 1, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love. 2, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ. And 3, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. The first part is that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love. This is not about theology. This is about the interactions within the community. Christianity is not just about the renewal of the individual, but the renewal of the community as well. This really shouldn't be surprising, though it may sound odd to modern Westerners. Church is a group of people, it is a community. We tend to think of Christianity as primarily an individual thing, but that has more to do with the fact that we are Westerners, and to us, everything is about the individual. This is something that we have brought to Christianity rather than something that Christianity has brought to us. Think for a moment about something we talk about all the time in Christianity: love. Love is not something you just have all by yourself somewhere. Love is something that involves someone or something external to yourself. You must love someone or something. Love, therefore, implies community. To love, at least love people, you must love someone. You must show love to someone. Sometimes the idea is floated that we could be really great Christians or really great people if no one else were around. You know, like we're on a desert island all by ourselves, or we're the last person left on Earth, like in some sci-fi movie. But living rightly is not merely by the absence of doing wrong things. If you remember, living as the image of God is about reflecting God to those around us. This implies community. Being a Christian is not something you can go off by yourself somewhere and do. It involves others. Turning to the heart and what that means, we should understand that when Paul talks about the heart, he does not mean some super sentimental, mushy kind of thing. The heart does not refer to warm, fuzzy feelings as it often does in English. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the word heart referred to the whole of human capacity for thought, judgment, and emotion. It's like your inside person. It's what makes you you beyond your physical body. So when Paul is talking about people's hearts being encouraged, being knit together in love, he's referring to something that's actually real and not some sort of gushy emotional kind of thing. He means the kind of encouragement that actually reaches down into who you are as a person and lifts you up, not merely some nice words that people say to you and you forget instantly, because they really don't mean very much. You know, they're just the socially accepted thing to say. Paul means that people have real connections with one another and actually care for one another as part of a real community, not just the surface-level fake relationships we often experience in what we call church. These words at the beginning of verse 2 seem like so many other nice Christian things to say, and we gloss over them. But they are, in fact, more than that. The second part of the hope Paul has for the Colossians is to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ. Paul talks about full assurance here, i.e., not a partial assurance. This is the continuation of a theme that began back in the hymn. Think back to the fullness of God dwelling in Christ. This choice of words is not accidental. Paul's point is that Christianity is all about fullness and completeness. The fullness of God dwells in Christ. Paul was filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions, which, as we saw, meant that he was carrying the message to unreached people. Paul desires full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, for the Colossians. So, there is the fullness of God in Christ, the fullness of the people hearing the message, and the fullness of understanding by people who have accepted the message. You can see here a fullness theme that emphasizes the importance of God's means of both revelation and renewal of humanity, Christ. The implication that we might also take from this is that if the fullness is here, then something less than fullness is to be found anywhere else one might look. Remember, full understanding and knowledge are to be found in Christ. Christ actually is the mystery. At the beginning of the letter, the Colossians were told to know God's will and to know God. Here they are told to know Christ, the object of that knowledge. The wisdom and knowledge we're looking for are to be found in Christ. The point of this was to assure the Colossians that they're not missing out on something. There is nothing outside of Christ that they need to have. There are not many paths to God. There are many ways that we can see a little bit of God, but the fullness of God dwells in Christ. Christ is how God chose to reveal himself to the world, so if you want to see the whole picture and not just part of it, then you need to look at Christ. The third part of the hope that Paul has for the Colossians is, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. This, very simply and redundantly, refers back to the point that is so often made that everything that one needs is in Christ. Here the focus is on wisdom and knowledge. If you remember from looking at verses 9 to 12, something like knowledge is not just learning some facts from a book that you have to repeat on a test. We're talking about knowing about God so that one can eventually know God. So again, Paul is making clear that if you want to know God or even know about Him, all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are found in Christ. We see a preparation here for the case Paul is about to make against the alternate philosophy. All the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are in Christ. Again, this doesn't mean that you can't find something somewhere else. It means that nothing is lacking here. Other sources are lacking things. You can find partial truth in a lot of places. Full truth, however, is only in Christ. I do want to make a brief explanation about something. Wisdom and knowledge are not exactly the same thing. Wisdom was often described as practical knowledge or skill. It could also be sound judgment, especially as it relates to life and conduct. Knowledge tends to be more theoretical, but it still has experiential and relational elements. There really isn't a sharp distinction being made here, since both are included. But while we're looking at it, I wanted to point out they're not exactly the same thing. They both have a practical and experiential component to them. Finishing up with verses 4 to 5, we have an introduction to the issue that we'll find in the next section. Paul warns the Colossians about being led astray by plausible arguments. By that he means arguments that sound good, but have a weak foundation. Think about the sort of argument that someone might make that sounds really good when they're talking, but when you question them, it starts to fall apart. It's like a debater who makes a really good opening statement. But during the rebuttal periods, his arguments start to fall apart because they really don't have any substance. Paul is basically saying that it doesn't matter how good something sounds in the opening statement. What matters is how good its foundation is. Does it hold up under scrutiny? That's where we're headed next time. Up to this point in the letter, Paul has been introducing the issue and laying out what he thinks is important to Christianity. In the next section, basically the rest of chapter 2, he's going to interact with another worldview that he doesn't want the Christians at Colossae to be enticed by. Next time we come back to Colossians, we'll start getting into the comparison of Christianity and the other worldview.